Hi, everyone. Gene here. Just wanted to remind you about the goal that I have set for myself and for the listeners of this podcast. That goal is for us to find 3,000 people over the course of the next year and have them start tapping in a regular way. And that doesn't mean that we have to find 3,000 people today, and it doesn't mean you have to do it by yourself. But if, as a collective, we found 9 new people every single day, and we taught them about tapping and we helped them tap more, maybe even shared a podcast like this or any of the other great tapping podcasts with them, it would make a difference in their life. And if we get to the point where we do get 3,000 people tapping, it's actually going to create this rippling effect where the transformation in their lives impacts our lives as well. This is Gene Montrastelli, and welcome to the Tapping Q&A podcast recorded live to tape from Williamsburg in Brooklyn. This is episode 356, originally aired March 27th, 2019. Hi, everyone. I hope this finds you well wherever you are and whatever time of day you get a chance to listen to this. Thanks for spending some time with me today. In today's show, we're going to be talking about the research and science behind tapping and what we know. Before we jump into that conversation, I just wanted to continue to thank all of the folks who listen to the podcast. We have been thanking every single country where it download registers in this calendar year. And so this week we want to thank the folks who are listening in Iran, Antigua and Barbuda, the United Arab Emirates, Serbia, Portugal, and Slovakia. I appreciate everyone who listens to the show, but those countries, we just thank them today. I also want to thank personally Marion, Mandy, and Renee. They all, in the last week, decided to support financially the Tapping Q&A podcast, which makes a huge difference. It allows us to keep doing this and delivering this content to you. If you too would like to support the podcast like they did, and you'd like to receive the amazing bonuses that they have received, all you need to do is go to tappingqa.com/donate. Today's conversation is with Dr. Peta Stapleton. Peta is a friend. She's been on the podcast a number of times talking about scientific research in the past. But very excitingly, next month, she has a new book that is being released called The Science Behind Tapping. It will be available worldwide April 16th. And in that book, she looks at does this comprehensive overview of all of the research that has been done around tapping in different topic areas, different types of modalities, so that we have in one place the opportunity to have access to all this information. If you'd like to purchase a copy of this, I've already pre-ordered mine, even though I've gotten a chance to read the book ahead of time. All you need to do is go to tappingqa.com/science, tappingqa.com/science, and that will redirect you onto the Amazon page where you can buy the digital version of the book or the paperback version so you can consume this amazing stuff. And so today we just have a conversation with Peta, talking about the book, talking about how she put the book together, what she looked at, and just as importantly, what she took away from that book that we can use. Because if we are able to more clearly articulate the value and power of tapping and the fact that there is science behind it, it's going to make it so much easier for the people around us to be open to maybe giving it a try. So here is my conversation with Peta about her new book. Tell me a little bit about the book and what was the intention behind creating it and how it came about.
So the science behind tapping came about because of a need, I guess. More and more people were asking, what's the evidence? What's the research? And finding it hard to understand academic journal articles. So in talking, obviously, to the publisher, we both decided that, yes, maybe there was an opportunity here to share the research, the evidence, all the studies, people's experiences, but in a really nice, easy to understand way.
So I was fortunate enough to get a chance to read the first 4 chapters of the book as before it has sprung on the world. And one of the things that I'm really impressed with is inside of the chapters that are about particular issues is how you've structured each of the chapters. Talk to me a little bit about the intention behind how you chose what would be in each chapter and kind of how you structured those particular pieces.
Yeah, so each chapter is devoted to its own research area or clinical condition, disorder, that type of thing. So, for example, off the top of my head, chapter 4 is post-traumatic stress disorder. So in doing that, really the intention was to make it easy for the reader, that if somebody was particularly interested in just one or two areas and what was the research and science with EFT or tapping, they could just read that chapter and find out everything to date. There it all is. And included in those chapters are the client stories from the clinical trials, their experiences. I just found that weaving those in gave people more of a picture of the human experience of what happens to somebody when they do go through a treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder or food cravings, weight loss, or a child with anxiety to do with public speaking. So those stories are woven into each chapter, but each chapter can stand alone. So it is, to me, quite an easy book to read, in that if there's only a few chapters you want to know about, that's nice and easy. Just go and pick those, read those, and don't worry about the rest.
And I think the other thing that I really appreciated looking at the PTSD chapter specifically was the way that you first spend some time talking about this is what it is and this is what we understand, and creating kind of a common vocabulary and groundwork for us to be approaching these things that I think sometimes for those of us who are just lay tappers, it's really easy just to look at a couple of symptoms and go after them. And that's a useful way to approach it. But by getting kind of a comprehensive definition of what we're working with, and then talking about things that have been tried in the past, I find that as a useful approach. Why did you think that was the best way to start the chapters out?
It's probably, Jean, my my academic training coming through, which I was trying to hold back on because, it's not always useful. But it probably was coming from that angle of telling a story as well as giving the information that we know is hardcore science, but at the same time making that a really user-friendly, and trying to find the sweet spot in writing the book did take me quite a while. And I will openly tell people I used tapping during the writing of this book because I really needed it. Just trying to find that sweet spot, like I said, and yeah, defining not just, because I think you're right, a lot of clinicians, practitioners, and, even health professionals look at symptoms. We target those obviously with EFT tapping, but there's a bigger picture sometimes, and sometimes there are clinical conditions and there are diagnoses and there are things like that. So I guess I've tried to paint the bigger picture of how much that might be a problem in the world in each chapter. So for example, that PTSD chapter does talk about how problematic is this at a bigger societal level? How many people are struggling? Who's really getting any assistance through other modes of, treatment, that type of thing? Same with anxiety and depression. So, it's trying to tell the story, but at the same time, educate along the way.
And I think the other piece that you did really well in that education is you have tips, but then you also have clinical guidelines. What for you in your mind as you were doing that? What did you see as the difference between tips of using tapping and a clinical guideline?
I think tips come from obviously the field. So people out there working in the field can definitely collaboratively share, hey, here's what works. You go to a training, you pick up other tips. And that really comes from clinical experience, which is gold. That in itself is absolutely useful for every clinician out there. Clinical guidelines, on the other hand, often stem from the research and are often a bigger group of experts that come together to put those together. So we do have those for post-traumatic stress disorder now with EFT, and every major EFT training organisation around the world collaborated on those guidelines and approved them. So we know now that if there is a clinician and they do want to follow the guidelines, they're in that chapter, so they can actually go through and go, right, my client actually meets that level of severity. Here's what the guidelines recommend I do as far as tapping goes. We've also, in the depression and anxiety chapter, done 2 expert Delphi studies, which are included, and we talk about what has come out of those experts as far as what really should you be targeting with depression and anxiety. And it turns out there's actually different things as far as speed of tapping, which maybe is not intuitive to a lot of people or doesn't really stand out, that if you tap slowly with a depressed person, it actually keeps them in the energy of depression. Whereas if you speed yours, so I share all of that because they came out of 2 expert consensus studies that were done in those 2 areas. So I hope that those guidelines probably extend people's work, and that they may not read those kind of things in a dry, academic, boring journal because they're buried deep, under a subscription service or something, and you can't read them. So that's what I'm hoping will shine through as well, and people can kind of go, oh, hey, I didn't know that. I probably was doing something like that, but now I've actually got some really good clarity around what the research says I should do as well.
And it's interesting, like when we look at the sense of research and seeing what's out there, for those of us who are trying to convince our loved ones and our clients that tapping is a good thing, actually having this background is useful. The thing I found most fascinating in the beginning part of the book, when you were talking about the research and the studies that have been done, is something that I had never heard of before, and that was something called dismantling studies. For a person who does not have a research background like yourself, in lay terms, can you explain what a dismantling study is, why it is valuable, and what we've learned when looking at EFT through those lenses?
Yes, so this is, I guess, the biggest criticism we get when we go to publish anything about EFT is journal reviewers will often say, well, how do you know that the outcomes are due to the tapping on the acupressure points and not due to the words that you're saying or not due to that breath that you take at the end of the round? So dismantling studies typically take a technique that has lots of different kind of components like EFT does. It has the tapping part, it has the words part, it has the deep breath part, it has the nice rapport building part with the person in front of them. And it makes all of those parts individual and then has a range of different conditions where they'll only do one of those. So, for example, a study might be, that group will do the full EFT sequence as we know it. The second group will do the tapping but not say any words. They'll just tap on pressure points while thinking about their problem, but they don't say anything in that setup statement. The third group might just do diaphragmatic breathing instead of the tapping. So they'll still say the setup statement and the words, but all they'll do is deep breathing. So you can see that it kind of takes apart the technique, and what we're ultimately doing is comparing all of those different conditions to see, do the individual components achieve the same outcome as the full EFT method as we know it. So that's what dismantling means, which those studies have actually been done, and there's around 5 of those that have been done now, are often done by people not in the field, which is actually even better because the level of bias that could exist is minimized. So it means that if somebody out there says, hey, I'm going to run a study and pull apart this technique and I have no interest in whether this works or not, I have no bias, and yet when they run the study, they still get the outcomes that suggest the full technique works better than anything else. It's even stronger when that gets published. So I talk about all the dismantling studies. I do talk about the problems that occurred with some of those studies where, funnily enough, in a couple of the studies, they used finger tapping, finger point tapping instead of tapping on our typical, facial points. But what happened in some of those studies was they inadvertently activated the finger points that used to be in, obviously, the 9-gamut, all of that kind of. So some of those studies had to be taken into consideration. Ultimately, all of those studies showed that the full technique of EFT works better than any single component. And now we even have a meta-analysis that we snuck into the book at the last minute after it had been edited, which showed that tapping on the pressure points is actually an active ingredient and works well and truly above and beyond any of the cognitive talking part and also the therapeutic relationship that might be there with the practitioner. So we've put that in there too, that meta-analysis has actually been conducted. Yeah, so it is really interesting. And I do dedicate a whole section early on in the book to just talking about what those studies showed, just because people want to know. They're like, well, has that been done? And the answer is yes, it has been done like 5 times by different people. And it still shows that tapping as its recipe works better than any other version.
And I really appreciate that because so one of the studies that you talk about in that is something where they're using what they call sham points.
Yes.
Where the difference between tapping on the prescribed tapping points versus just tapping anywhere randomly. And as I was reading it just kind of made me smile because oftentimes when I see places where they're trying to debunk the value of tapping, the thing that they point to is that particular study. where they're saying, well, we just tapped on dolls and we tapped on these other points and there was all of this valuable stuff. And to have kind of a comprehensive look at that particular study to see what were its strengths and what were its flaws, to kind of realize the reason why they came to those conclusions, I think is helpful for us, because if those sorts of things are in the popular consciousness, when we're having conversations about people being able to speak cogently about the research and what was actually going on, is only going to strengthen our ability to just have good constructive conversations with people as we kind of navigate all of this.
That's right. And even us, when we go to publish our standard EFT trials, we try to openly discuss what the limitations were of that study. And that is what I've offered with those dismantling studies, and that description is to sort of say, yeah, here's what they found, but here's also why we know they may well have had an outcome by tapping on dolls, because mirror neurons are, in effect, that kind of thing. And we try to do the same. So we kind of acknowledge that maybe there were things in our study too, or, that we still have to consider before we make sweeping generalizations. But hopefully, and the whole intention, I guess, overarching was to help people in the field be able to talk about the science and the research and understand it.
And so as you were going through this process, even though you've been in a circumstance that you've been reading studies for a long time and you've been doing research for a long time, what were some of the things that surprised you as you were doing a deeper dive and trying to just consolidate this data and this information into a way that was useful for others to consume?
Yeah, Jean, I really thought that I knew most of the research that was out there. So I had this one single folder, all the studies in little categories, going, yep, that's all good. And then started to discover there were EFT, like what we consider obviously the clinical EFT method, studies that had been published in countries we'd never heard of, had no idea that people were even researching it, on topics like, does it help with mathematics tests, in war-torn kind of countries compared to other numerical kind of techniques? And we were like, we had no idea that some of these studies had been published and were buried deep, but had been published in the last 5 years.
Right.
So that was, I guess, to me, quite surprising that I actually found health condition studies that had been done with what we look at as traditional EFT and published, but buried out there that nobody knows about. So I've tried to bring a lot of those to the fore as well. And I have also included other tapping techniques. So the book does, right at the end, talk about EFT is the main tapping technique that's been researched, but there's other tapping techniques that have as well. So I do talk about the research around Tapas Fleming's TAT, her acupressure technique. There's another one called PEAT, PEAT, obviously TFT, thought field therapy. There's clinical trials published on that. So I talk about trauma tapping techniques, other clinical research that's been done on similar tapping techniques that have still achieved similar outcomes. So hopefully that might be surprising to a lot of people who read it. They might realize, like me, I had no idea there's actually been studies done on, how to reduce nausea from chemotherapy with breast cancer patients with straight EFT, that type of thing, as well as the mathematics study we found and a few others.
So as you were doing this, as you were looking at the research, did you have any beliefs that you had either changed, or you thought one thing and then you saw the data and you all of a sudden realized it was something else? Like, not just the breadth of the research that was out there, but were there actual learnings that you had in the process?
The learnings, Jean, were probably more about myself than the data, which I'm really happy to talk about. I probably nothing, because I've been in the field for a long time, nothing surprised me as far as outcomes I was reading or limitations I might have found in studies, that type of thing. I mean, that's all sort of by the by. It was more what was coming to the surface for me writing the book, which thank goodness I had tapping. I was forever thanking my lucky stars as I was writing. What would I be doing if I didn't actually have tapping, as I could kind of tap through this? Right. And a lot of that, it surprised me because, being kind of one of the people, worldwide that does do a lot of the research, I didn't realize I had some doubt in myself about being able to deliver this. And that took me back. So, and I'm quite happy to share that because I used tapping on that in the process. And I had a colleague, again, who's in the field, who was able to be an advocate for me and hold a mirror up and really challenge me on a lot of things. And I went away and diligently did my tapping, because that surprised me. It probably took my breath away a little bit, that I had no idea I actually still had some doubt about being the best person to present this. And a lot of people might be surprised to hear that, but that's just what happened for me. So I worked through it. I did tapping, and I got to the other side.
And feel free to, like, if I get too personal in this, feel free to just steer clear of all of this. So was the concern a concern about your authority? Was it a concern about your experience? Was it a concern about just you personally being able to navigate it? What did that fear look like as you were trying to navigate that?
It wasn't experience. It probably was more authority. And it's funny, you hear those sayings about, people are an overnight success, yet they were chipping away for 25 years at it. And that's how I feel. Like, I've been doing EFT research and publishing for the last 16 years. So it's certainly not a, overnight kind of thing where we've popped out with all this research. But it was a level of authority, just because I do consider that there's other people in the EFT research field who are senior as well. And perhaps at some level, I wasn't considering myself to be along that same kind of, seniority. And people might want to argue with me about this, but that's where I was at the time.
Right,
and
absolutely.
And I know how it was showing up, in that I couldn't find the sweet spot in writing this book. And the publisher was very obviously clear that they didn't want an academic book. They wanted it for the general community to be able to understand. I was quite happy to write like that, but that's how it was showing up for me, that I couldn't find the sweet spot. And the more I worked on myself with that doubt and being able to deliver this, the more I found the sweet spot, and then it started to flow. And I'm always looking at that. If something's not flowing, there's some sort of block. So that's, to me, that was my barometer, if you like, but I kept working. I had a mentor locally, and I kept working through it, and laughed a lot and cried a lot and stressed out a lot. And nobody will know unless they listen to this interview, Jean.
That's right.
Yes.
But I think the thing that points to inside of that, as any sort of creative endeavor, I think that's good for all of us to hear, is to recognize the fact that, we do ourselves a real disservice in the way that we compare other people's facades to our internal experience. And, you were comparing what was going on inside of your head to someone else's CV. Yes. And of course we're going to lose that comparison every single time.
Because I know, you never win.
Because we know, because we're, there's no difference between to the outside world, there's no difference between being brave and acting brave.
Yes. Yeah.
And that comparison makes a great deal of sense. So thank you for your willingness to kind of be vulnerable and honest about that as you navigated that particular thing.
Yeah, look, happy to share, because I guess I don't want people to think that it wasn't necessarily an easy process. And I did reject Reed Tracy, CEO of Hay House. I said to him, no, I don't want to write this book. And he said, yes, we want you to write this book. And I'm like, no. I said no to him 3 times. And he just laughed. He just laughed and brushed it off. And I just went, okay, right, this is happening. So I am really happy to share that, but only for the point of letting, I guess, readers know that we struggle too at these levels. And with a tool like tapping, it is something you can use to obviously, navigate, process, move on from those hang-ups.
So I just want to poke into a couple of the chapters here. And if you want to just highlight a piece of research or something interesting that you found on a number of these topics, just what this rapid fire, whatever comes to mind, the thing that strikes you the most. Stress and anxiety. What do you remember? What do you think about when you think about that chapter or the research that we know around stress and anxiety?
We know it's such a big problem worldwide. What struck me in that chapter was, I guess, the statistics, and I opened the chapter with talking about obviously how much stress affects the general population, but in particular young people with technology. Like, it's just overwhelming, and even, American sort of psychiatric association stats and things like that talking about how much they're suffering. And so some of the case studies that I share in that particular study, obviously we talk about the research, which, helps with performance anxiety and other clinical anxious issues, stress, that kind of thing, cortisol. But case studies that we garnered from practitioners in the field, which really were about teenagers and how they managed to turn around different situations, some of them quite kind of traumatic situations that they had gone on to kind of have quite stressful, anxious profiles as adults, but through EFT were able to turn that around. But also, I guess, some of the studies where unusual areas that maybe just people in the general public don't think that it could help, like, before music exams. So there's a case study in there around a musician who learnt EFT to obviously help process those kind of nerves and things. So normally we think about performance anxiety, public speaking, that type of thing, but lots of areas that EFT can be applied, and particularly in things that have other levels of performance, like music, that sort of thing. So I talk about some of those case studies in there as well.
There's an entire chapter, and it just springs to mind because that answer. There's an entire chapter that's dedicated to young people and students. What has the research shown that is unique about young people tapping? Is it about their disposition and willingness or resistance to it, or is it specifically about the issues that they're finding success with?
Yeah, that chapter, and I highlight that chapter that we do need more research, not particularly with college students. There is a lot of research on university college students, lots of different areas. Yeah.
Because you have access to all those students.
I have all of those students
on campus. They're all right there.
And so does Dr. Dawson Church. So there's a lot of research on those. But we've done a couple of school trials here, so that's more secondary school. So we've got those obviously included, and most of those are in the public eye. But to me, there's an area missing in this where we need more studies and research done on the younger children, so perhaps 10 years and younger. So there's not a lot of clinical trials that have been published. We certainly know anecdotally it works. I have a now 11-year-old in my house, but even when she was much younger, obviously did tapping. I can openly say, working in that population, it's much easier. It's so easy to teach little ones tapping because they don't question it. Yeah. So, but I'd love to see more research, perhaps from other researchers. I don't know that it's my dharma to take on, in those younger age groups, just to sort of show, these little ones really do, take it on easily. They really get outcomes quite quickly, and to watch that over time would be really fascinating. We actually have a whole school here. We've got our tapping in the classroom, which is our teacher training. It's worldwide, but particularly here in Australia. But we have a whole school now in one of our states where every teacher has trained in EFT in a primary school. And we're tracking that school, and I won't be able to kind of give outcomes for a while, but it's been 12 months already. So we're tracking those children that start off in their little preppy years. So they're about 5 years old, and they'll finish school when they're around 12. And the principal is the guiding force behind this to see how does tapping affect those children over those sort of 7 years. And it will be fascinating. It's almost like it's a little incubator that's happening in one of our states. And I just chatted yesterday to the school psychologist who was part of setting it all up, and how it's all going, that kind of thing. So we'll start to get some measurements and things like that. But I think to see more research in that area would be fabulous, just to help people with, I guess, the evidence, that type of thing.
As always, I appreciate the fact that Peta takes time for us to have a conversation. She being in Australia on the other side of the world from me, it's always a creative endeavor for us to be able to have an interview. Most of the time when we do the interviews, we're actually on different days. I was in my Monday night. She was already up and into Tuesday morning when we did this particular recording. If you would like to find a copy of the book, again, easy way to get you redirected to the exact right spot. If you go to tappingqa.com/science, if you're listening to this in the website, that link is above the player. If in your podcatcher you go into the notes, you'll see a link to it, and you can click right on it. You can get the book. And so on the 16th, you'll be able to dive in and really learn from. I appreciate the fact that it's not just, hey, it works, but this specifically works better than that. This is what we know from the research. This is how we talk about it. And again, like I said at the top of the show, the more fluent we are in being able to talk about this clearly, the easier it is going to be for people to say yes and to give tapping a try. If you enjoyed this interview, please be our ambassador. Pass it on to a friend. Don't spam your entire inbox, but just let them know that this resource is here. If you go to tappingpodcast.com, you can find this and every other episode that we have recorded in the past. We are closing in on 450 total audios between episodes, half episodes, bonus episodes. All of them are there absolutely free of charge. If you have a question, if you have a comment, if you have a guest recommendation, the show that we're doing next week actually happened because of a listener just like you recommended an amazing topic. I can't wait to share that interview with you. If you have a topic, you have someone we should talk to, let me know. I can always be reached, Gene, Gene, at tappingqna.com, or all you need to do, if you're on the website, click on the contact link. If you are in the Tapping Q&A app, which is free, click on contact. You can send me an email or a voice memo from right inside of the app. If you don't have the app, it is free. You have access to every single audio from the website, plus a bunch of tapping scripts. You get notifications when new audios show up. It's free. Just go into the App Store for your Android or your Apple device. You can find it absolutely free of charge. For the Tapping Q&A podcast, this is Gene Montrastelli. I hope you have a great day, and I will talk to you real soon. Bye-bye. The Tapping Q&A podcast is copyrighted Gene Montrastelli, Tapping Q&A 2016. All views expressed by guests are those of the guests and not necessarily of Gene Montrastelli or Tapping Q&A.